Thomism and phenomenology have an ambiguous relationship. On the one hand, several influential 20th century Catholic thinkers, including St. Theresa Benedicta of the Cross, or Edith Stein, and Pope St. John Paul II, are closely associated with both philosophical traditions. On the other hand, those who self-identify simply as Thomists view phenomenology with a certain degree of suspicion and are skeptical about dialogue between these two traditions. My goal in this talk is to present and examine the philosophical reasons for this suspicion and skepticism. Now, there are lots of non-philosophical reasons for doubting or dismissing phenomenology on the part of Thomists. So, a Thomist might be personally immature, might have be following the bad examples of others. He might have been traumatized by a gang of phenomenologists insulting his mother, and so on. I'm not interested in those kinds of explanations for dismissal. Instead, I want to focus on the principled and properly philosophical reasons that a Thomist might have for skepticism about the fruitfulness of dialogue between the Thomistic and phenomenological traditions. As such, this talk will be partly sociological and partly speculative. It will be sociological insofar as it catalogs and presents the actual arguments that I have heard Thomists make against such dialogue. It will be speculative insofar as it will also present arguments inspired by those past criticisms, but which are, at least to my knowledge, entirely novel arguments. The plan for the talk is simple. In section 1, I'll present a family of arguments for skepticism about dialogue that I call impossibility arguments. In section 2, I'll present a different family of arguments, which I call impracticality arguments. And then in section 3, I will weigh in on which, if any, of these arguments succeed in raising real problems for the prospect of dialogue between the two traditions. So section 1, impossibility arguments. I'd like to begin by considering what I take to be the more radical of the two sets of reasons for skepticism about dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology. I call these arguments impossibility arguments because they take the following form, and you've got this on the handout. Thomists shouldn't try to do the impossible, but dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. Ergo, Thomists should not try to dialogue with phenomenologists. I doubt that anyone on either side of the debate will object to premise 1. But why endorse the minor premise? Well, the first thing to note about that premise is the as such qualifier. Premise 2 is not claiming that dialogue with phenomenologists is impossible. After all, Emmanuel and Walter are both phenomenologists. And I, a Thomist, am currently dialoguing with them. Well, monologuing at you, but eventually the dialogue will come. Ergo, dialogue between phenomenologists and Thomists is not impossible. Rather, what the second premise is denying is the possibility of my dialoguing with them precisely as phenomenologists. For while it is true that they are phenomenologists, and it is true that I, a Thomist, dialogue with them, it does not follow that I dialogue with them insofar as they are phenomenologists. Perhaps my dialogue with them is possible because deep down they are really Thomists. Or, more ironically, perhaps it's possible that I dialogue with them because all of us are at least implicitly committed to a sort of lowest common denominator perennial philosophy. The precise account there is not important. What is important is that premise 2 denies the existence of common ground between Thomism and phenomenology as such. But even with that qualification in mind, why should we think that premise 2 is true? Thomists give numerous answers to that question. But of all the answers that I've heard, we can group them into two categories. And I consider these to constitute two sorts of subclasses of impossibility arguments. no such thing arguments, and incommensurability arguments. The general forms of these arguments are also provided on your handouts. Now, I want you to note that these subclasses of impossibility argument are mutually exclusive. If there's no such thing as phenomenology, then phenomenology and Thomism cannot be incommensurable. Likewise, if phenomenology and Thomism are incommensurable, then there must be such a thing as phenomenology. Thus, even though both sorts of arguments have been offered by Thomists in the past, at least in my experience, no single Thomist can actually endorse both kind of argument, at least on pain of contradiction. So let's begin with the no such thing argument. Like the general form of the impossibility argument, the no such thing argument has, to my mind, an unobjectionable major premise and a very objectionable minor premise. The question is why anyone would want to deny the existence of phenomenology. After all, that sounds crazy. But I have encountered at least 4 not so crazy arguments in support of that crazy sounding thesis. Each one of those arguments trades on a different account of the unity of a philosophical movement or school or tradition. So these arguments appeal diversely to unity coming from shared doctrines, unity coming from shared methods, unity coming from shared authorities, and unity coming from shared topics. Being a Thomist, I think of these as material, formal, efficient, and final causal sources of unity, respectively. So, the argument from material or doctrinal unity goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive doctrinal unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. That phenomenology lacks even minimal doctrinal unity should be clear. After all, some phenomenologists are realists, some are idealists. Some phenomenologists are Marxists, some are capitalists. Some phenomenologists are moral objectivists, some phenomenologists are moral relativists. Pick any topic you want, and you will be able to find phenomenologists who disagree about that topic. Moreover, even if you could find some topic on which all phenomenologists happen to agree, I don't think that agreement would be necessary. I don't even think the phenomenologists themselves, you can correct me if you want, would think that that agreement is necessary. Now, the presupposition behind this argument, of course, is that doctrinal unity is what constitutes a philosophical movement or school. While not unobjectionable, I do think that that's not a crazy assumption. After all, Thomists may debate about the merits or demerits of the 24 Thomistic theses, but we don't debate about whether Thomism comes with some doctrinal commitments. An atheist Thomist is not a Thomist. A second reason for thinking that there's no such thing as phenomenology would be because it lacks methodological unity. Now, prima facie, that might sound strange. After all, isn't the phenomenological method precisely the thing that phenomenology is most known for? It is. But as soon as we ask what precisely that phenomenological method is, things get dicey. Does the phenomenological method require us to bracket questions about the existence of things or not? Does it require agnosticism about the veracity of experience or not? Does it require a commitment to idealism, maybe even transcendental idealism, or not? Moreover, now I'm going to do something mean, as Mark Spencer has pointed out, there are marked differences between Husserl's phenomenological reduction, Jean-Luc Marion's phenomenological reduction, and various realist phenomenological reductions. What, if anything, he asks leadingly, do they have in common that distinguishes them from non-phenomenological philosophical schools or movements? Answering that question is extremely opaque. Perhaps for that very reason, Walter Hoppe has argued that it is important not to place too much emphasis, and this is a quote, upon the phenomenological reduction as the touchstone regarding what is and is not phenomenological in character, close quote. In light of such caveats, Thomists frequently voice the worry that phenomenology amounts to little, if anything more, than an exhortation to pay careful attention to how things appear to you. Now, that exhortation is laudable, but it's not one that we need to turn beyond the bounds of Thomism to hear. Our own tradition already contains all the resources required to enjoy that harvest. The argument from formal or methodological unity then just goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive methodological unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. A third version of the no such thing argument comes from the view that philosophical schools are constituted by authoritative unity. The idea here is that philosophical texts and figures can and do become authoritative for subsequent philosophical groups or communities. This does not mean that everyone in those communities or traditions blindly follows the quote-unquote authorities. Rather, what it means is that those authors and texts, the authoritative ones, directly or indirectly frame the questions that are raised, the debates that are had, and the answers that are given in the tradition that follows them. One would be a Thomist, for example, to the extent that his or her approach to and thinking about ontology or ethics or epistemology is directly or indirectly framed by the thought of Aquinas. By this measure, however, phenomenology is not a philosophy at all. For you might think that the authorities would be Husserl and Husserl's subsequent school. But that's problematic. Franz Brentano, for example, is regularly referred to as a practitioner of phenomenology, and yet he predates Husserl and the Husserlian school. Likewise, and even more to the point, recent literature in comparative philosophy has drawn attention to so-called Buddhist phenomenology, which is entirely unconnected, at least from an efficient causal point of view, from European phenomenology. If that's right, it gives us a third rationale for affirming the minor premise of the no such thing argument. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive authoritative unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. The fourth and final rationale I've heard Thomists give for insisting that there just is no such thing as phenomenology in any kind of real sense is an argument from what I call teleological, or kind of more properly, topical unity. The argument goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive topical unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. Here, the idea is that branches of philosophy are individuated by the topics that they study, knowledge of which is the end or goal or telos of that branch of philosophy. That's why I characterize it as teleological. So the philosophy of physics is distinct from the philosophy of biology precisely because they aim at knowing different things. They are about different topics. When considered in this way, phenomenology is usually described as studying the structures of consciousness or experience. But it isn't obvious that that's a distinctive topic, for that could plausibly be reduced either entirely to the philosophy of mind or to some combination of philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. And if that's the case, then it would seem like there isn't really any such thing as phenomenology. Phenomenology is just a label that we give to a more fundamental, real branch of philosophy. Now, thus far, I've been reporting on arguments that I've heard Thomists give in the wild, so to speak. But I think that these arguments can also be systematized and combined into a sort of no such thing master argument, which I've put on your handouts. So you can peruse that at your leisure. For now, however, I want to remind you that no such thing arguments are not the only kind of impossibility arguments on offer. At the beginning of this talk, I also mentioned what I call incommensurability arguments, where no such thing arguments view phenomenology as so insubstantial that there's nothing to dialogue with. Incommensurability arguments view phenomenology as so substantial, so solid and self-contained, that there's just no way for the Thomists to break in and begin dialogue. But despite that obvious and important difference, the different forms that are taken by incommensurability arguments parallel the different forms of the no such thing argument, at least in my experience. For I've heard Thomists suggest that dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology is impossible on the grounds of doctrinal incommensurability, methodological incommensurability, authoritative incommensurability, and topical incommensurability. With respect to doctrine, by far the most common objection on the Thomist side is that phenomenology is explicitly committed to or implicitly entails agnosticism about what is real. That's the best case scenario. Or, at worst, it either explicitly commits to or is implicitly entailing of idealism. And given the centrality of Thomism's commitment to realism in the face of agnosticism and idealism, the absence of common ground on that point would seem to entail an absence of common ground on virtually any subsequent point. With respect to method, the most common objection is that phenomenology works eidetically, whereas scholasticism works dianoetically. Or, to put it in Thomistic terms, phenomenology engages only in the first and second operations of the intellect, while scholasticism engages in all three, and with an emphasis on the third. A more refined version of this objection goes like this. Thomistic philosophical methodology requires the kind of search for real causes that is productive of scientia, or Aristotelian episteme. But the phenomenological method explicitly prohibits that sort of search for causes. Ergo, Thomism and phenomenology are methodologically incommensurable, and as a consequence, it is impossible for Thomists and phenomenologists to dialogue as such. In other words, if dialogue is going to happen, phenomenologists will have to stop acting like phenomenologists, or Thomists would have to stop acting like Thomists. With respect to authorities, the argument is fairly straightforward. It is a sociological matter of fact that the questions Thomists raise, the debates Thomists have, and the answers that Thomists give are in no significant way framed or influenced by the authoritative figures and texts of the phenomenological tradition. In fact, one could go further and observe, again as a sociological fact, that such figures and texts are ipso facto held at arm's length and viewed with skepticism by the Thomist. Edith Stein is not a Thomist. And the same thing is true in the opposite direction. Most phenomenologists, when handed the Summa and told that they would benefit from reading it, will gaze into the face of the other with a capital F and capital O, with eyebrows raised and an incredulous stare. The Summa won't speak to them. Finally, I can report coming across one form of incommensurability argument from the perspective of topic or telos. It goes like this. Supposing that there is something that really distinguishes the topic of phenomenology from philosophy of mind or something like that, it will be this. It will be that the sorts of structures of consciousness and experience that phenomenology is interested in, as opposed to, say, empirical psychology or analytic philosophy of mind, those are the sorts of structures that apply equally to absences as to presence. They apply equally to first-order thoughts and perceptions as to higher-order thoughts and perceptions. They apply equally to veridical experiences and to non-veridical experiences. From a Thomist point of view, that sounds like phenomenology is claiming to be a super transcendental science, the subject of which is prior to and abstracts from the distinction between real being and being of reason. And we Thomists don't think that there can be science of such things. Dialogue, then, between Thomists and phenomenologists is no more possible than it is between a contemporary physicist and someone who claims to specialize in phlogiston or ether. Right? From the Thomist perspective, there's just no such thing as a super transcendental sense of being that's prior to the present and the absent, the veridical and the non-veridical, the real and whatever, right? So dialogue is impossible. Now, as with the no such thing argument, I think that these various incommensurability arguments, all of which I have come across in the wild, can be gathered together and domesticated in the form of an incommensurability master argument, which I have also provided on the handout, and you can peruse at your leisure. Moreover, I also think that the no such thing master argument and the incommensurability master argument can be combined into a sort of all-encompassing impossibility master argument. And for Patrick O'Brien fans, I label this the commander argument. For now, however, I want to turn away from the entire category of impossibility arguments and introduce what I take to be a more moderate set of arguments, namely impracticality arguments. This is the shorter section 2. Impracticality arguments do not claim that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists is impossible, just that it's not a good idea. In other words, Thomists can dialogue with phenomenologists, we just shouldn't. And impracticality arguments take the following form, which I've given you on the handout. Thomists shouldn't engage in an impractical waste of time, but dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. Ergo, Thomists shouldn't dialogue with phenomenologists. As with the general form of the impossibility argument, I doubt that anyone on either side will object to premise 1. But why think that dialogue with phenomenology is an impractical waste of time? Here again, I limit myself to arguments I've actually been given by fellow Thomists. The first, and by far the most common one, is the minimal payoff argument. It goes like this. Doing something with minimal payoff is an impractical waste of time. Dialogue with phenomenologists as such has minimal payoff, so dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. In my experience, this argument usually takes the form of a series of rhetorical questions. What real benefit will I get, my Thomist confrere asks, from studying phenomenology? What truths will I learn from phenomenologists that I couldn't learn from St. Thomas and the Thomistic tradition? Are there essences they'll teach me to grasp that I couldn't have grasped otherwise? Definitions I'll understand that I couldn't have understood otherwise? Properties I'll discover that I wouldn't have discovered otherwise? And the implicit answer to each of these questions is none, none, and none, respectively. But if that's correct, if that's even close to being correct, then there are good grounds for affirming the second premise of that minimal payoff argument. From the perspective of these Thomists, the burden of proof is on the phenomenologists to explain what, if anything, they bring to the table of dialogue that the Thomist might be interested in exchanging ideas for. Now, this strikes me as a quasi-material argument since it mainly concerns phenomenology's doctrine or content. It's also worth pointing out that this minimal payoff argument very plausibly cuts both ways. For triumphalist phenomenologists are just as likely to think that they have nothing to learn from the Thomists as a triumphalist Thomist is to think that he has nothing to learn from the phenomenologists. From their perspective, then, the burden of proof will be on the Thomist to show that we have something of value to bring to the table of dialogue. Now I want to turn to a second impracticality argument, one that similarly cuts both ways. I call this the new language argument. It goes like this. Learning an entirely new philosophical language is an impractical waste of time. But dialogue with phenomenologists as such requires learning an entirely new philosophical language. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. Though similar to the minimal payoff argument, the new language argument stands entirely on its own. Even if there were substantive truths that only a phenomenologist can teach, those truths might still not be worth the price of admission. And the reason, so this new argument goes, is the enormous amount of time and energy required to attain fluency in phenomenology. For that's precisely what phenomenology is to the Thomist, and what Thomism is to the phenomenologist, a foreign language. Each one has its own vocabulary, its own grammar, its own idioms and turns of phrase. In Thomism, you can meaningfully ask whether a subalternated science differs from a subalternating science on account of its ratio formalis sub qua. In phenomenology, you can meaningfully ask whether the noematic correlate of transcendental consciousness emerges only through an exercise of epoche. In each tradition, these questions make sense. To one another, they do not. The new language argument, then, is a quasi-formal argument, since it concerns how phenomenology is practiced rather than what phenomenology preaches. Now, the obvious objection to that argument is that sometimes learning a new language is not a waste of time. Suppose, just hypothetically, that you move to a foreign country to teach at a pontifical university, but you don't learn the language before you arrive. You will, just hypothetically, find yourself at a deep disadvantage, and you might resolve to become fluent. Could the same not be true for philosophies? Sure it could, but the impracticality argument assumes that it almost certainly will not. When phenomenologists and Thomists dialogue, we are more like sightseeing travelers than job-seeking immigrants. The amount of time that a phenomenologist is likely to spend in the land of Thomism and the amount of time that a Thomist is likely to spend in the land of phenomenology is small. Too small, so the argument goes, to make acquiring fluency worthwhile. You can get by in Rome with just English. But, just for the sake of argument, let's assume both, one, that we have a phenomenologist who is fluent in Thomism and a Thomist who is fluent in phenomenology, and two, that there is something to be learned, one from the other. Now can we guarantee that dialogue will be worthwhile? Not according to a third impracticality argument, and I call this the different thought world argument. It goes like this. Dialogue between people from different thought worlds is an impractical waste of time, but Thomists and phenomenologists as such are from different thought worlds. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. If we think of the minimal payoff argument along the lines of material causality and the new language argument along the lines of formal causality, we can think of the different thought world argument along the lines of efficient causality. For this has to do with our earlier discussion of authorities and the way that our entire viewpoint is framed by those authorities. The idea is that even if Thomists and phenomenologists understand one another perfectly and have truths to teach one another, they won't care about those truths. For a truth is exciting and interesting only insofar as it answers a question or solves a puzzle. But Thomists don't ask phenomenological questions, and so aren't animated by phenomenological answers. We're not excited about discovering paths back to the things themselves because we don't view ourselves as having ever left the things themselves. It's not a problem that we've inherited. Likewise, phenomenologists don't ask Thomistic questions, and so aren't animated by Thomistic answers. They are not excited about the idea that prime matter might bear a transcendental relationship to quantity. Why? Because they've never been vexed by the ontology of the problem of individuation in the first place. In other words, the questions, concerns, and conversations that have come to shape these two traditions are just so different as to constitute practically different worlds. The final impracticality argument that I've come across is the time better spent argument. And I see it as a kind of final causal argument. It goes like this. Whatever keeps us from something better is an impractical waste of time, but dialogue with phenomenologists as such keeps us from something better. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. In essence, the Thomistic proponent of the time better spent argument says something like this. Look, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with dialogue or with phenomenology. I'm just saying there are only so many hours in a day. And if I have to pick between spending one of those hours reading St. Thomas and spending one of those hours dialoguing with a phenomenologist, I'm going to pick St. Thomas every single time. I just get more out of it. Now, critical reflections. What should we think of these arguments? How good are they? Perhaps unsurprisingly, I think that some of these arguments are better than others. When it comes to impossibility arguments, I worry that the first premise in both of the master arguments equivocates on the term phenomenology. Phenomenology as a field of study is not the same thing as phenomenology as a philosophical tradition. It's the field of study, not the tradition, that is plausibly unified topically or what I call teleologically. So let's focus on the field of study. If we think of phenomenology as a field of study, then I'm inclined to grant the version of the no such thing argument that says that phenomenology can be reduced to a material part of one or more genuinely joint-carving branches of philosophy. If phenomenology amounts to nothing more than the study of structures of consciousness or experience, and all experience is either sensorial or intellectual, then from the Thomist perspective, phenomenology will not be a really distinct science or study vis-a-vis de anima and de intellectu. From a Thomist perspective, you do those two things, you've done phenomenology. Now, considering phenomenology as a philosophical tradition, I don't think the unity there is grounded in either unity of doctrine or unity of method, for a very simple reason. I don't think that the unities of philosophical traditions in general are grounded in doctrinal or methodological unity, at least not normally. You might be able to come up with a weird counterexample. I do, however, think that philosophical traditions are at least normally individuated by authorities. As such, I'm happy to grant that if phenomenology, understood as a tradition, lacks a unity of authority, then there would be no such thing as phenomenology. But I also think that's false. Franz Brentano can and should be included right there alongside Husserl as one of the authoritative figures in Western phenomenology. And there's no problem with just adding him as an authority, or better, recognizing that he is an authority. Moreover, the tradition of Western phenomenology can and should be distinguished from that of Eastern phenomenology precisely because, despite their topical overlap, they have different authoritative texts and figures. The crucial question, then, is whether or not the authorities of the Thomistic and phenomenological traditions differ so much as to render them incommensurable. And I think the answer is no. For one of the virtues of an authoritative account of the individuation of philosophies is that it's graded, not binary. To the extent that our thought is framed and shaped more or less by figure A than figure B, we can and do belong more or less to A's tradition than to B's tradition. I am a card-carrying, unapologetic Thomist. And that's true not first and foremost because of the doctrines that I profess or the methods that I employ, though there are doctrines I profess and there are methods I employ. Rather, it's because my thought world is predominantly framed in terms set by Aquinas and his subsequent followers. Nevertheless, to the extent that my thinking about, say, the foundations of mathematics is framed by Husserl, and even more by Husserl than by Frege, to that extent, I also belong to the phenomenological tradition, and more to the phenomenological tradition than to the analytic tradition. Mutatis mutandis, the same holds for literally any other issue. So, when it comes to the impossibility argument, I think that if phenomenology is understood as a field of study, the argument works. Why? Because the no such thing argument works. But if phenomenology is understood as a philosophical tradition, the argument fails. For there's no good reason to think that someone can't be more or less influenced in their thinking by the authorities of different philosophical traditions, like phenomenology and Thomism. Still, that is only to admit the possibility of dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology. It doesn't yet guarantee the fruitfulness of that dialogue, which brings me to the impracticality arguments. My problem with the minimal payoff argument is the minor premise. The only way for a Thomist to know that there's minimal payoff for dialoguing with phenomenologists is if we actually try dialoguing with phenomenologists. Thus, I'm inclined to accept this argument if it's coming from the lips of a veteran Thomist who has engaged in good faith attempts to dialogue and has simply come away disappointed. I am not inclined to accept this argument. In fact, I am inclined not to accept this argument if it's coming from the lips of a triumphalist undergraduate Thomist who has only read Ed Feser. Now, with respect to the new language argument, it's the major premise rather than the minor premise that I find objectionable. We don't need to achieve fluency to learn how someone in a different tradition would articulate a problem or express an answer. Moreover, learning enough of another philosophical language to be able to translate back and forth isn't just a valuable tool for dialogue, it's also something that enriches how we understand and approach our own tradition. Because the ability to translate even in a minimal way back and forth requires us to go back to the basics and approach the fundamentals of our own tradition from a different perspective. And that is richly rewarding. Now, I think the major premise of the different thought world argument is similarly problematic. As we've seen, authority-constituted philosophical traditions are graded, and they admit of more or less, both with respect to how deeply one can belong to a given tradition and with respect to how many traditions one can belong to. As such, there might be reason to think that the more purely Thomistic a Thomist is, and the more purely phenomenological a phenomenologist is, the more difficult dialogue will be between the two of them, since they will need to work extremely hard to get themselves in the headspace, so to speak, of one another, understanding what their concerns are and where those concerns are coming from. But it can be done. And doing so is an excellent way to inculcate the intellectual empathy that's characteristic of a mature philosopher. So that's a good. When it comes to the time better spent argument, I think we should deny the major and distinguish the minor. The major premise assumes that we are somehow bound to always make the best possible use of our time, and I think that's false. As long as we aren't using our time wrongly or badly, we're free to do whatever we want. Human beings are not machines intended to optimize efficiency. Now, regarding the minor premise, I'm happy to grant that it might be true sometimes. But it's hard for me to take seriously the idea that it's true all the time. After all, dialogue is a part of a healthy intellectual life. Okay, having subjected various arguments against Thomist phenomenologist dialogue to a bit of critical scrutiny, I'd like to close with a few observations supporting the skeptical attitude that they represent. The first is this. No one is obligated to engage in dialogue. If there are Thomists who just want to read Aquinas, or phenomenologists who just want to read Husserl, we should let them. They aren't doing anything wrong. Second, While I've argued that the impracticality arguments fail when taken as universal in scope, and I've identified some goods that accrue to dialogue, I haven't identified any of those goods as uniquely or characteristically phenomenological. And there's a very simple reason for that. I'm honestly not sure there are any. In other words, while I affirm both the possibility and the possible fruitfulness of dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists, I'm not confident at this point that there's anything special about phenomenology that makes dialogue with phenomenologists more desirable than, say, dialogue with Platonists or analytic philosophers or American pragmatists. Knocking down the impracticality arguments against dialogue is not the same thing as making a positive argument for dialogue, let alone for dialogue with phenomenologists as such. It's possible that phenomenology, and not just phenomenologists, have something really important to teach Thomism that Thomists cannot discover on their own. But of that, I'm pretty skeptical. So maybe you can convince me otherwise. Let the dialogue begin. Thanks.